What's up guys, Asian here again with another video, and today we're going to be going over patch 6.1.5, which is the Stonethorn DLC, or update 27. First off, apologize if the audio is a little bit weird here. Like I mentioned in my community post, I'm still moving into a new apartment and the streaming setup is not quite what I want it just yet. Hopefully, I'm ordering a couple new parts in, so hopefully that'll be here by Wednesday or Thursday. We do have to contend with Tropical Storm Marco and Hurricane, blanking on the hurricane's name, but we are dealing with those two hurricanes down here in the Gulf Coast, so might be a little bit until we can get those going. So 6.1.5 is the Stonethorn DLC. And this is a dungeon pack, so you're getting two new dungeons here. So we're getting those two dungeons, so we're getting Stone Garden and Castle Thorne. With those we get 3 new armor sets and 2 new monster helm sets, and they also went through and did quite a bit of updates with some of the older item sets in order to kind of bring them up to their, I guess, standards, so to speak. So, like the rest of our patch notes video, we'll really be focusing in on the PvE changes. There are a couple of big changes to PvP as well this patch, but we're not really going to be focusing in on those, mainly because I'm not a PvP player, and I never have been, so I'm not really 100% certain what the impact of those changes actually will be in Cyrodiil and Battlegrounds and so on. Anyways, moving on here. So these are the new sets here. First, from Castle Thorne, you have Talfig's Treachery, which is a light armor set, so you get spell crit, max magicka spell damage, and the 5-piece gives you a flat increase of 372 to your spell damage, but it also increases the damage taken from flame and fighter skilled abilities by 10%. So this is going to end up being stronger than Julianos. Julianos gives you 300 spell damage as a flat bonus on the 5-piece here, and in PvE, obviously this isn't that big of a deal. You're getting a little bit more damage from flame, and obviously PvE mobs don't do fighter skilled abilities too much, if at all, so don't have to worry about that part of the ability either. So this is actually not a terrible set, but it's just overshadowed by a bunch of other stronger sets that could be a little bit easier to obtain, like Mother Sorrow, for example. The medium set is Unleashed Terror. You get weapon damage, max stamina, and then when you deal direct damage with a charge, leap, teleport, or pull ability, you cut your enemy, cause them to bleed for 10 seconds, dealing 19,728 physical damage over the duration. This can occur once every 10 seconds. You're not going to really be using any of those abilities too much in PvE, and the bleed damage itself is actually not very powerful, so this is going to be a decon set. Then we have Crimson Twilight, which gives you health, healing taken, and health. And then the 5-piece, after taking damage, you surround yourself within an 8-meter mist of blood. After 2 seconds, the mist is violently siphoned into your body, dealing 822 bleed damage to nearby enemies and healing you for 100% of the damage done. And this is going to occur every 8 seconds. This is basically just another version of leeching armor, basically. Just instead of dealing damage over a period of time, these are all in one go. So this could be helpful for those of you guys who need additional heal, especially in trash fights. So it could be useful, but generally speaking, you don't really want a healing selfish set as a tank. You want more group utility oriented set. So this is a set that I would say just pass on. Go ahead and decon it. Then we have Lady Thorn, which is actually a very interesting set here. So the 1-piece adds max health, and the 2-piece, casting an ability that costs health, spawns a blood ball for 10 seconds. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. You or an ally near the blood ball can activate the Sanguine Burst synergy, dealing 5,000 disease damage to nearby enemies and applying Major Maim for 5 seconds. Enemies can only receive the Major Maim once every 30 seconds. Now the thing with this isn't necessarily the Major Maim. There are other sources of Major Maim and just generally damage reduction, which is a little bit easier to get than Lady Thorn, which is just basically a synergy every 30 seconds for a 5-second Major Maim. Not really that great. But what's interesting here is the fact that you do create your own synergy and you can activate it yourself. So for tanks in particular, this basically gives you another way to proc Alkosh. So that helps with Alkosh uptime, which is going to be very important due to the new changes that they introduced with Alkosh. Now Stonethorn, Elemental Catalyst adds Magicka spell crit magicka, and then whenever you deal flame, shock, or frost damage, you apply a stack of flame, shock, or frost weakness to the enemy for 3 seconds. Each stack increases their critical damage taken by 3%, and an enemy can only have 1 stack of each elemental weakness at a time, so you can have a maximum of 3 elemental weaknesses, flame, shock, and frost, for a total of 9% additional critical damage taken. We've already examined this set a little bit in depth here on this channel. And pretty much the general conclusion is that this is most likely going to be on a Magicka Necromancer. So you're going to have a Magicka Necromancer running probably Master Architect and then Elemental Catalyst as the ultimate sort of buff bitch, so to speak, for a Magicka Necromancer DPS. It still remains to be seen whether that's the best spot for it, but with the fact that it only lasts for 3 seconds, I think Magicka Necromancers are going to be running this set. So if you are a Magicka Necromancer DPS, make sure to farm this set. Kraglin's Howl is the medium armor set, which gives you crit, stamina recovery, and weapon damage. After an enemy you recently damaged dies, let out a howl, granting 3 allies within 15 meters the Heed the Call synergy. Activating synergy gives you and the activator 12 ultimates. This effect can occur once every 20 seconds. Obviously not very useful because you have to damage an enemy and it gives you a synergy. Only 3 allies can activate synergy and it only gives you 12 ultimate. Not very powerful. Decon material. Arcus's Genius gives you max health, armor, and max health again. And whenever you drink a potion, you and 3 group members gain 44 ultimate. This effect can occur once every 30 seconds. So this could potentially be okay to use. The average amount of ultimate you're going to be getting is about 1.5 ultimates if you're drinking a potion every 30 seconds or so. In order to get that every 30 seconds, you're going to need to run 3 potion cooldown glyphs. If you run infused, you will have a cooldown that is less than 30 seconds, so you don't necessarily want to do that. Now this does buff 3 other group members and does give you a fair amount of ultimate, but ultimately I don't think it's really going to be all that useful here. Even for a pre-buff set, the amount of time you're spending buffing with this and then swapping to your primary set, even if you have a bunch of DPS doing it, I don't think it's really going to be worth it. So this is another set I would say decon. Then Stonehusk is the Monster Helm, which gives you weapon crit on the 1 piece and a 2 piece. Your heavy attacks tether you to enemies within 10 meters for 5 seconds. Enemies touching the tether take 1906 physical damage every second, and you gain a stack of Husk Drain up to 15 stacks. Tether is broken if the enemy moves 12 meters away from you. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. When the tether ends, you consume the stacks and gain 30 weapon damage per stack consumed for 5 seconds. This set is activated on all heavy attacks, not just fully charged heavy attacks. Now, I don't think this is really going to be all too useful. So if you get the full 15 stacks, that ends up being 450 additional weapon damage, which is pretty decent, but you do need to basically last for the 5 seconds, and it deals damage every 1 second. So you need to basically deal damage to 3 different enemies in order to get the full 15 stacks. So chances are, if you're on a boss, you're not going to be able to get those 15 stacks. You're going to be getting maybe between 5 to 10 stacks, which will only get you 150 to 300 weapon damage, which is not really that strong for a Monster Helm set. You're better off running something like Celine's or Marcelox instead. Moving on here, this is an optimization DLC as well, so they did optimize a couple of things with server stability and stuff like that. They did introduce character pathing in housing, which is actually pretty neat. Obviously new furnishings and all of this stuff here. Now moving on next to the combat changes here. So for Kind's Agents, they did do a couple of changes here. Mostly it's just bug fixes here. But they did nerf a couple of things here. For example, the duration of the stun from Vampiric Grip and so on. Moving on here. Let's see here. Not much else here. We want to go to combat, which is right here. So there is a dev combat here. So again, all item sets in the game have been updated to use better logic when attempting to determine their proc conditions. So a lot of proc sets no longer have a set chance. They have a guaranteed set chance to proc, and to kind of counteract that guaranteed chance, they did rebalance some of the values here and there. They've also introduced new AoE adjustments to backend operations to help reduce their messaging. So a lot of stuff basically here is just to kind of reduce the amount of calculation the service has to do. Hopefully that does end up reducing lag here and there. So a lot of issue fixes here, but generally speaking, nothing to be really concerned about here. Fix a couple issues here with the DK standard. Coagulating Dragon Blood, they increased the base healing a little bit here, and the value of the heal should be slightly weaker than something like Breath of Life or Blood Sacrifice, while above 50%, but slightly stronger when below 50%. So it's a little bit of a buff here. Inhale got a little bit of a buff as well. Deep Breath deals more damage on the explosion. Draw Essence heals for more when depending on how much damage you're doing. Necromancer, a couple of issues here and there that were fixed here. The big one here is going to be detonating Siphon, which is a stamina morph of Siphon. This now explodes whenever the tether ends, so you can recast it early and it'll still have the explosion. So that's pretty useful here. They did revamp Grave Grasp, but I don't think it's still going to be that useful. So you still have the 3 AoEs. First one snare, second one immobilizes, the third one stuns, and each one will apply minor maim. But generally speaking, this is wasn't really a good ability to run in the first place, and it still isn't, because now if you want to get that mobilized, you kind of have to make sure to hit the second area. If you want to get the stun, you gotta get the third area. So I think this makes it more difficult to use rather than easier to use. Under Nightblades got quite a bit of buffs here. So they removed the cooldown from Executioner, and it now triggers whenever an enemy dies within 2 seconds of being damaged by you. Doesn't have to be assassination ability anymore. The big one here is going to be Grim of Focus though, so this now grants 2% critical damage and healing per stack rather than reducing damage taken by 2% per stack. So tanks, you do lose that 10% additional damage taken buff, but DPS, now you get 10% additional critical damage. So you're getting a little bit more critical damage out of this, so this does end up overall increasing your DPS as a Nightblade by a pretty decent margin here. Now, Master Assassin, the weapon and spell damage is now granted to your attacking enemies, damaging attacks against enemies you are flanking, which is a flat 129 or 258, depending on what value you have here. This is also a big buff to Nightblades because, generally speaking, except in a couple of scenarios, you will be flanking the bosses, so you will be getting that 258 weapon and spell damage now. With Master Assassin here, which does end up boosting your overall DPS. So Nightblades, you guys got a pretty decent buff this patch here. Other than that, not much else here too much. Let's see here. Under the Sorcerer, Sorcerer's got a bit of a change here with Crystal Shard. So now you guys have a stamina spamble here. So you reduce the damage and cost down. They also reduce the cast time. Crystal Frags can now proc off of itself, which is actually pretty cool. So now you can basically potentially cast frags over and over again, depending on if the ability procs itself. Then Crystal Blast is now the stamina spamble, so to speak, and it's renamed Crystal Weapon. It's now an instant cast ability that causes your next light or heavy attack made within 4 seconds to deal additional damage equal to the standard spamble amount, such as Lava Whip or Veiled Strikes. Enemies hit by this ability will have their armor reduced by up to 1,000. So this basically works the same way as Elemental Weapon does on a Magicka DPS, except with the added bonus of having some damage, armor reduction as well attached to it. So not bad, a bit of a change for Stamina Sorcerers as a class Stamina Spamble now. The only class that doesn't have a good Stam Spamble now is DKs. We still are waiting on that Stam Whip there. Now, under Daedric Summoning, all pets will now use a hybrid of your spell damage and max Magicka. So this is actually a pretty significant change here. So now you don't necessarily need to run Necropotence or any sort of max Magicka buffs here, because now it uses also your spell damage as well. Rebate now restores 150 to 300 whenever one of your Daedric Summoning non-ultimate abilities end. And then Unstable Familiar got a couple of fixes here. So a couple of things here and there, a couple of fixes here. Templars, so they did rework Burning Light. So now the damage triggers when you deal damage 4 times in rapid succession, rather than having a flat 25% chance to proc per hit. So this does end up possibly being a bit of a nerf here to Burning Light DPS. I have to double check the DPS logs, but I think this did end up being a slight nerf to the Burning Light DPS. Puncturing Strikes, they basically reduce the tick frequency down a little bit, but you're not really going to notice it too much here. Let's see, and then Radial Sweeps has a cast time. So much like in cap, you now have a cast time if you're doing Radial Sweep here. A couple of issues fixed with Backlash. Ritual Retribution no longer morphs and now just deals just raw damage, so you don't have any healing here with Ritual Retribution anymore. Healing Ritual got a pretty hefty buff to their resource, so it now costs significantly less here, 2k less, but you also get a decrease in the healing as well. And then Lightweaver has been updated, so healing an ally under 50% with any Restoring Light ability restores 1 or 2 ultimates, so there's that. A couple of fixes here for Warden, so here. Under here, a couple of fixes here with Toxic Barrage. Destro Staff, they fixed a couple of issues. Dual wield Destro Staff, two-handed charge. Stampede now causes the initial hit to deal AoE damage. Fixed issues here and there. Overall, just a couple of issues that are fixed here and there. Vampires, you're no longer a thing. You were here for one patch, that was it. Fixed a couple of issues with Swarming Scion, but the big one is Eviscerate. So they decreased the execute multiplier down to 33%. They also decreased execute multiplier on Blood for Blood to 60%, and now it ranks up in execute scaling damage. But after casting this ability, you can't be healed by allies for 5 seconds. So the kind of ideal back in Greymoor was to use Blood for Blood and have your healers heal you through the damage. Can't do that anymore. So Vampires DPS, you're going to want to get rid of that pretty much as soon as you possibly can. Blood for Blood is no longer a good spamble for pretty much any of the classes in the game right now. Werewolf, they added a couple of fixes here and there, but nothing too big here. And then Vigor is now the first ability under the Assault line to unlock. So that is swapped places with Rapid Maneuvers here. So you're going to have to level Rapid Maneuvers up in order to get Vigor. I believe that is Assault level 5, so you'll need to get that in order to get Rapid Maneuvers now. Rapids. Now, under item sets, they made quite a few changes here. We covered this in a couple of the past patch notes here, but Divines was buffed, Impen was nerfed, Infused was buffed, Invigorating was buffed, Nirnhone was nerfed, and Well Fitted was buffed as well under armor traits here. Weapon traits, Decisive was buffed, Defending and Sharpened was buffed, and Precise was also buffed. For jewelry traits, Arcane Robust was buffed. Bloodthirsty has now been completely changed, so it now grants up to 350 weapon and spell damage against targets under 90% health, scaling linearly per 1% missing health. And this is not affected, by the way, by any sort of percent modifier. So major sorcery, major brutality, for example, that's not affected by the bloodthirsty thing. Harmony was nerfed, health was buffed, Swift was buffed, Triune was buffed. Munda Stones, Atronach and Serpent were buffed, Mage and Tower were nerfed, Lord was nerfed, Lady and the Lover were nerfed, the Thief was buffed, Ritual was nerfed, the Shadow was also nerfed, but you also get additional critical healing with the Shadow now instead. Now they did change all of these sets here, so pretty much all item sets have been audited to reduce their implications on performance. Proc sets will no longer do additional range checks on events that have already passed once, such as events triggering off of a light or heavy attack. No longer send messages to the server when they fail or are on cooldown, and are properly labeled as a proc set to ensure they do not trigger other proc sets, so procs can't do procs. So all item sets now have radius checks for friendly targets to no longer target all allies, but instead target group members instead. So no longer will you be able to heal everybody from the item set, you'll only be able to heal group members only. I believe that has more implications for PvP than PvE, really. So crafted sets got quite a few changes here. Not all of them are particularly interesting. I'll just touch on the interesting ones. Let's see here. The big one here is New Moon Acolyte, which they nerfed New Moon Acolyte down to 401 instead of 481. So this is probably more for PvP. I've seen more of talk on PvP. PvE, this is going to be a nerf, so you might not want to run New Moon Acolyte any longer in PvE, but that is something to consider here. Mechanical Acuity no longer has that proc chance associated with it. Remember, they're removing all proc chances now, so this might actually be pretty decent now, because now you don't have to worry about the proc chance. In terms of a crafted set, there are obviously going to be stronger sets out there, but as a crafted set, this is actually pretty decent now. But beyond that, Torg's Pact now increases potency of your enchants by 45% and reduces the cooldown by 33% now, so a little bit of a buff here. Overall, still not going to be something essential, even for supports. There are other support sets that are going to give you more return than Torg's Pact, but it is something to take into consideration here. Now, under the Overland sets, a couple of changes here that I do want to make note of here. Briarheart's actually pretty decent now that it no longer has a proc chance. You pretty much have a guaranteed 300 additional weapon damage along with the heal. The heal is reduced a little bit because you no longer have the proc chance, but it's still pretty decent now. It's a little bit of a buff overall. Let's see here. There are other Overland sets here. Let's see. Livewire is going to be a little bit better for tanks now that they reduced the cooldown and removed the proc chance here. Mother Sorrow got a little bit of a buff, but not too much. Not really worth talking about. Plague Doctor got a slight nerf. Again, not really worth talking about too much here. So looks like the Sun might actually be pretty decent for Mag Decays, because they did change the 2 set to a spell crit rather than max health. So this could be useful as a budget set for Mag Decays. And then I think that's pretty much it here for Overland sets here. Now for dungeon sets, there are a handful here that are actually going to be pretty decent here now. Burning Spellweave no longer has a proc chance, but because of that, it's actually still a little bit of a nerf because they did nerf the actual spell damage granted to you. So it is still going to be a little bit of a nerf compared to the current, or should I say old Burning Spellweave now. So just take that in consideration here. Let's see here, other dungeon sets here. Again, not really too much to talk about. Both Herstines and Worm now grant stamina or magicka regen respectively, rather than reducing the cost. We covered this in a previous video. This is generally speaking going to be a buff to both of them. Hollow Fang got a bit of a nerf to sustain, but not too much. 2523 down from 3000, so not that big of a deal here. Still going to want to run Hollow Fang for Magicka DPS set groups here. Let's see here. Medusa is now much more of a Magicka oriented set here, so 2 to 4 pieces are now all spell crit, and you also have additional 900 spell crit. The other 5 piece is just have minor force active at all times. There have been tests done between Medusa and Mother Sorrow, and they're both pretty similar in DPS, but Medusa you do have lower sustain, so it might not be worth running Medusa, but Medusa is very competitive with Mother Sorrow, in some instances beating out Mother Sorrow, but you are trading off sustain because this is a heavy set. Other than that, I believe that's pretty much almost everything. Spell Power Cure might be very useful to hold on to now. Grants Major Courage when you overheal the target for 5 seconds, rather than having 50% chance to grant it when you heal them at 100% health. And no longer has a 6-person target cap, so we can hit all 12 people now. It grants Major Courage for 5 seconds whenever you overheal, which in PvE is fairly common. You're pretty much always overhealing in PvE, so this might actually be pretty decent because there are changes that they did make to Olorime as well. I'll cover that probably in the next section here. Togvins has been nerfed quite a bit actually, so they increased the weapon crit granted to 134 per stack, but they also reduced the number of duration of stacks to 5 seconds, so it's not really that great any longer. You do need to pay a little bit more attention to Togvins now. This is pretty much very similar to Advancing Yokeda now, where you're going to want to make sure you're not on your back bar for too long. This is still going to be the go-to for bow builds, I think, but for melee builds, Togvins might not necessarily be the best choice any longer as sort of a backup set, so to speak. Now for trial sets, so Automated Defense, Master Architect, War Machine, and Inventor's Guard now affects 6 people, so you and 5 others. And you get 1 second of Major Slayer or Major Aegis for every 14 ultimate used. So this is the big change to Master Architect here that makes it very powerful on Magicka Necromancers, because if you're using it with the Colossus, you're getting that Major Slayer, you're getting that Major Vulnerability on the boss as well, plus with the amount of ultimate you're using up, you're getting 20 seconds around-ish of that Major Slayer, I believe. Let me just double check really quick. It's 225 divided by 14. So you're getting about 16 seconds of Major Slayer. So if you rotate it out, you should get a Major Slayer up every 48 seconds. With your standard ultimate generation of 3 ultimate per second, you won't necessarily be able to hit the amount of ultimate you need in 48 seconds, but if you are timing it with the Major Vulnerability immunity, which is 20 seconds, if you do 20 by 3, you're getting 100, not 20 by 3, 60 by 3, you're getting 180 ultimate back. And Necromancers, you do have some additional ultimate gain as well. So if you really use 3.5 by 60, you do end up getting 210 ultimate back. So you should have very little downtime on Major Slayer if you're going that route here with a Master Architect on a Necromancer. So that is definitely something to consider if you are a Magicka Necromancer. Make sure to pick up a set of Master Architect. Reliquant has seen quite a bit of a nerf here, so you can only get 10 stacks and you get 300 damage per stack rather than 200. So your max damage previously was 4,000 at max stacks, now it's 3,000. So a little bit of a nerf here. So just keep that in mind. It's still going to be one of the better options for single target DPS, if not the best option for single target DPS, but it is going to be a little bit of a DPS drop compared to previous patch. Berserking Warrior or Advancing Yokeda now grants you 305 weapon crit, so a little bit less than that, but you get 10 stacks now. So rather than 2,000 weapon crit, you get 3050 weapon crit. The duration of each stack is 5 seconds now, so you do want to be careful with this. This buff actually does make Advancing Yokeda one of the best sets now, front bar sets I should say, for stamina DPS. So for those of you guys who have held on to your Advancing Yokeda, great job. You guys might have predicted this, but this buff to Advancing Yokeda definitely makes it a very powerful front bar set for stamina DPS now. False God got a bit of a nerf, so they removed the 5 set bonus on spell damage and the bonus Magicka on the perfect version to better mirror VO. So a little bit of a nerf here. The only reason you're going to be using False Gods now is going to be just for the sustain, so you're going to want to reuse a different set potentially in trash fights if you have no problem sustaining. Let's see here. Sororia has also received the change, so you get 52 spell damage per stack and you get 10 stacks. So rather than 600 spell damage, you get 520 spell damage here. Now, this might seem like a nerf, but this does make Sororia and Reliquin too a little bit more viable for their weaker sides of things. So Reliquin, the big downside was you had to build up your stacks for AoE fights. It wasn't that great for AoEs. For Sororia, same thing. You had to build up your stacks to get higher spell damage now. But because Reliquin now has fewer stacks and deals more damage per stack, and Sororia has more spell damage per stack and has fewer stacks, it's actually easier now to get higher spell damage with those lower stacks now. So for example, the old Sororia, if you want to get, let's say, 150 spell damage, you would need to get 5 stacks. Now you only need 3 stacks, which is a little bit easier to maintain. So it is an overall nerf to damage, but in terms of overall usability, Sororia and Reliquin did get a little bit of a buff here. Roar of Alkosh has been revamped a little bit here. So now it deals 30,010 damage initially and 11,020 over 10 seconds. The armor shred is now based on that initial hit, so that 30-10. Now, this does mean it is buffed by things like percentage modifiers. So damage done modifier, CP modifier, damage taken debuff on the boss and things like that, which makes it possible to hit very high initial hits with Alkosh, which does mean Alkosh now provides even more armor shred. On a typical tank, you should be able to hit 4,000 fairly reliably in terms of armor shred. So this is going to be a buff to Alkosh, making it more important than ever to make sure you have high uptime on Alkosh. Now for Roaring Opportunist. So this now applies to 6 group members rather than 12, and they completely changed how you proc it. So the old one was based on the amount of damage you did when you cast a heavy attack. Now the duration scales off of your spell damage and max Magicka, so 1 second per 1,000 spell damage and 1 second per 6,000 max Magicka. The intended values are the ones listed on the tooltip, so the tooltip is different. I believe the tooltip is 1 second per 630 spell damage and 1 second per, I want to say it's still 6,000 max Magicka, I want to say, or something like that. So it is going to be a little bit easier to get higher uptimes on a future patch, but this does make it a little bit more consistent. You can just have your attack twice in order to apply to 12 group members now, so that's something you want to take into consideration. The maximum uptime with RO and JG is, I believe, 17 seconds, so pretty much similar, a little bit higher uptime compared to running Master Architect on a Magicka Necromancer. Now, if you're running RO and JG on a healer, that means you're shifting Zens or Martial Knowledge to a DPS. So that means you're going to be giving up a little bit of DPS here because you won't be able to run a Nightblade DPS instead, because it's not really good to run Martial Knowledge Zens on a Nightblade. You could run it on a Magicka Necromancer, so you can still have 3 Magicka Necromancers, MA Zens, MA Martial Knowledge, MA Elemental Catalyst, for example, but that also ends up reducing DPS for those 2 Magicka Necromancers that are running Zens and Martial Knowledge. So remains to be seen whether ROJG is going to be the way to go, or 3 MA Magcros with Zen and Martial Knowledge on the healer. So we're going to be waiting on the high-end guilds to kind of test it out a little bit in actual trials to tell us what the best thing to do is. But I think for less optimized groups, progression groups, you're going to want to go with the MA on the Magicka Necromancers. Lachesis has been nerfed, so the duration is down to 10 seconds. So you can still get 100% uptime on the Major Slayer from Lachesis, but with the buff to Berserking Warrior, Advancing Yokeda, it is going to be a little bit stronger than Tooth Lachesis if you're not able to get that full uptime on the Major Slayer bonus here. And then finally, Olorime here. So they did reduce the duration to 5 seconds. So both Spell Power Cure and Olorime give Major Courage for 5 seconds. Maximum targets for Olorime is now 6, down from 12, but it can still affect more than 6. But basically, you can only get 6 people per tick. They reduced the duration of the Major Courage to 20 seconds. So Olorime gives it for 20 seconds. Spell Power Cure gives it for 5 seconds. The circle for Olorime lasts for 5 seconds. That's what it is. So both of these now have their own kind of use cases. Olorime is still going to be useful. The Spell Power Cure, the benefits that it has, the buffs that it got, does make it a little bit more viable in certain scenarios. So you are going to want to have both sets on hand as a healer now. Then finally, for PvP-oriented sets, not a lot of these are used in PvE too much. The only one is really powerful Assault, which now grants 307 weapon and spell damage to group members within a 10-meter radius for 10 seconds. So this is a little bit of a buff. Still going to be a little bit tricky to use, but with that buff, I say if you can fit it into your support toolkit, definitely do so. Obviously, this is going to be more of a tank-oriented set rather than a healer-oriented set. But definitely try to get Powerful Assault in your set somewhere as a tank because of that buff to the amount of weapon and spell damage that it provides. It is affected by all the percentage modifier, so this actually is a very, very powerful bonus here. So that's pretty much everything here. Oh, Monster Helms, that was the last one here that we kind of have to cover here, as well as ability altering weapons, otherwise known as arena sets. So not much here in terms of Monster Helm sets. They did rebuff Bloodspawn, so 13 ultimate per proc, so this is more for PvP, less so for PvE. Tanks, you can still use Bloodspawn, but it's obviously not the ideal set to run. But other than that, not much else here from Monster Helm sets. So they did change the Concentrated Force set to require 2 Force Pulses, but it's still not going to be good for Magicka DKs, so please stop asking if whether or not Asylum is good for Mag DKs. Since they fixed the bug, it is not going to be worth running. And finally, Thrassian is dead. So you only get 23 weapon or spell damage per stack. Stacks last for 1 hour. And the set now causes you to lose 120 max health for every stack you have. Maximum number of stacks is 50, resulting in 1,150 spell and weapon damage, minus 6,000 health, and minus 50% shield efficacy. So Thrassian is also dead. One patch, only Greymore. So sorry guys, but Thrassian is definitely dead. But that pretty much concludes it for this patch notes. This was a bit of a long video, but a lot of stuff to cover here. As always, I have a link in the description below to the full patch notes, so you guys can read everything at your own leisure. That's pretty much it. Build videos will be coming out as soon as I get my streaming setup all set up. It is going to be a little bit different. I will kind of break it down in the community post once I have all my streaming setups all put together. So be on the lookout for that community post, kind of detailing how this build is going to go. And just as a reminder, this is the last DLC I'm going to be doing build videos for. I am officially going to retire from ESO content creation at the end of this sort of build cycle. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.